Sorry. Just to let you know as well is that we are recording this session today, so that's just something to note as well, that we are recording today's session. So I'll share my screen when it comes up. 1 minute. Maybe a little bit of technical challenge here in getting the right screen to show. Bear with me for a sec. Okay, and sharing now. Mel, do you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, Al, thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Okay. All right, well, welcome everyone. Today's Lunch and Learn session is on delegations within Workday. I know there's been a lot of questions regarding the delegations functionality within Workday. So now hopefully you've had a chance to have a play within the system. What I wanted to run through was a little bit of the background information to both the inbox and delegations, and then obviously answer any questions that you may have in regards to that. So I'm assuming that you've all had a chance to log in to Workday, so I won't sort of show you how to access Workday, but what I will start to go through is if I can just reference that we have a new HR Authorization Schedule. So for those of you who maybe were familiar with the old HR Authorization Schedule that had been in place for some time, we have replaced that with something called the HR Sub-Delegations Instrument. And the way to find that document is if you go into the PPL, you can find the HR authorizations. So I'll find that out for you. I can search the site this way. If you click on, hopefully it's the old document, so please don't use that one. You go to the HR, oops, sorry, this one here. Sub-Delegations Instrument, you can click on this latest version. So this is something that has just been published, and we will remove the other document so that this is the most up-to-date version. So please use the one that was September 2021. So what we've done is replace, as I mentioned, the HR authorizations, and we have the concept of management levels now being introduced to the university. So management levels are similar to the authorization level that we had in the old HR authorization schedule. So for instance, the Vice Chancellor sits at management level 1. The Vice Chancellor's immediate direct reports, such as the Provost and Chief Operating Officer, DVCs, at management level 2. You have Executive Deans, the Provost, Deputy Provost, the PVCs, Central Directors, etc. as management level 3. And you have heads of schools and other sort of key roles as outlined on this page as management level 4 and so on. So one of the more important things to sort of note in regards to delegations is the importance of these management levels, because they will determine the authority level for your approvals within Workday, and also it will determine who can hold a delegation within Workday as well. So please do read through this document. It's now only 6 pages instead of the old 18 pages that I think we had in the old HR authorization schedule. So the first page really is just to sort of articulate which of the different roles sit within which management level. So that's the first thing to just note. And then on the next 2 pages, we have all the different tasks that can be done from a HR perspective, articulated, such as hiring of individuals, etc. And they are grouped by the different types of positions, for instance, that they may be hiring to. So for example, if you're trying to hire a level E academic position in the university, you'll see here that any advertisement or appointment, renewal or changes to those positions, the authorization level is management level 2. It also follows the supervisory line of these individuals. So for instance, any level E appointment in a school or faculty by nature will go up to the management level 2, which is the provost. So the office of the provost is effectively the management level 2 position that is assigned to approve any of those level E appointments. So that's just to note who holds a substantive authority to approve any of those different activities within Workday. So for instance, if it was a level B to D position, it is management level 3, which is the executive dean, for instance. And so anyone before that particular approval or final approval step will be effectively an approver in Workday, but effectively it's an endorser to that particular approval process. So it's really important to note who the final approval step sits with, as the final approval is determined by this authority level within this schedule. So if, for instance, that a job requisition or an employment offer within Workday is being generated from a head of school, that would then go up, for instance, for level B to D to the executive dean. If the executive dean, if it was a B to D, it would be sitting with the executive dean as final approval. If it was a level E, it would go through the executive dean to the provost, for instance, for the final approval in the provost's position. So that's something to note as to where it sits within the particular approval step. The other thing to note on this page is we have a little tick symbol with a W, and that means that those individuals can hold an ongoing or a short-term delegation within Workday to be able to approve those positions as well. So as an example here, we have a little tick and a W for management level 3 for the approval of a level E position. So that might be, for instance, where Aidan, as the provost, is away on 2 days, for instance, for a conference, and he's asked the deputy provost, Tim Dunn, to approve within Workday his approvals. And in that particular instance, he's set up then as a delegate for the provost for those 2 days in Workday, and he is able to, as management level 3, hold that delegation within Workday. And then effectively what he can do is approve any level E appointment on behalf of the provost for those 2 days that Aidan would be away, for example. And so that's an important concept to also note, which is who can also hold that delegation within a Workday context as determined by this little tick and W symbol. There are 2 other special cases just to call out in regards to delegations according to the schedule, and that is the general manager role and the executive assistant role. And so those 2 roles have specific authority, again, according to this instrument here that we've got on the page. So for instance, you have the general managers, which are defined according to the schedule, and they can approve professional staff appointments, as you can see here, for instance. If it's a Q9 position, for instance, that's coming up in a faculty structure, the general manager, which let's say, for instance, is the school manager or the FEM, let's say it's an FEM, who in this case is the general manager, they are by authority from the schedule able to approve on behalf of the executive dean position, for instance, a Q9 position within a faculty, as long as it's within a professional role only. So you can see here the note is that the general managers are able to approve professional positions only in the supervisory line of their supervisor or manager. So if it was an academic position, that general manager, the FEM, wouldn't be authorised to approve that particular appointment within Workday itself. So there's just something to pay a little bit of attention to, is the specific instances in which general managers can approve on behalf of their supervisor. And the other particular one to call out is executive assistants. And executive assistants are able to approve certain types of activities within Workday, in particular training or development activities, and leave approvals, certain types of leave approvals as determined here as well. So that means, for instance, if you have, as an example, Aidan as the provost, and you have Mon, who's his executive assistant, and the deputy provost has applied for leave, some recreation leave, assuming that's approved within Workday, and Aidan has set that up as a delegation within Workday, Mon can approve on his behalf the recreation leave or annual leave application that's been made within Workday. So that's, again, just to sort of pay particular note to those special cases where executive assistants can approve on behalf of the manager, or general managers can approve on behalf of their manager as well. So I might just pause it there just quickly, Mel, and to see if there's any Q&A that's coming up that specifically questions the authorisation schedule at all.
Nothing in the Q&A or the chat at this stage, Al.
Okay, great. So that's the first thing that I mentioned I would have a look through, is to familiarise yourself, if you haven't yet done so, with that new instrument of subdelegation that grants those particular approval levels and management levels, particular approval pathways. So I've mentioned that. So just in terms of the actual inbox management then, so depending on the role that you have, if you are, for instance, a general manager, such as a school manager, BDO, FEM, etc., then, as I mentioned, you should be set up within Workday, assuming your supervisor is comfortable for that delegation to be set up for you, so that you can make those approvals as per the schedule that I just showed earlier. Similarly, with executive assistants, assuming that your supervisor is comfortable for you to see their inbox and to work with all the approvals that I mentioned as well, then effectively that's what we're advising, is that we set up those delegations for you. So what effectively we're sort of suggesting is that you basically go into Workday to set that up, and it actually has to be the person who's creating that delegation to be able to set that delegation up. So what I might do is just quickly guide you through how that's done within Workday. I see there's a few Q&A topics coming up now, is that right?
Yes, there are.
Any questions?
So we've got one from Bronwyn just in regards to how long would we recommend the delegations to be set up, and should this be annually? Do you want me to take that, or are you happy to take that?
I can quickly answer that. Look, I think it is something that, depending on the length of time, so there are sort of several use cases for delegation. So some relate to short-term coverage. So someone, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, is going on leave of absence, or they're going on, they're 2 days away for a conference, for instance, and that's an example of where you might want to use delegations for a short period of time. And then you have other use cases, for instance, for executive assistants or for general managers and so forth, that you might want to set up those delegations for a longer period of time. There's no real guidance. If you believe that there's a benefit to having it set up for 2 years, that's completely fine. If it's 12 months, you're just going to have to renew that delegation again in another 12 months' time. So it really does depend on the context. You do need to put an end date into the delegation itself. But as to how long you think that makes sense, it's really up to the conversation with yourself and the supervisor or whoever is setting up the delegations within Workday.
There's another.
Yeah, sorry.
Another one is if the EA's manager is not a level 4 authorizer, can the EA still have delegation? Will it limit what they can approve?
Yeah, so I'll come back to that. You can still have delegations, but it does limit to what you can approve in Workday. So you can still do the inbox management, but the approval process itself is different. So what I'll do, and I'll describe that as I go through this. So in order to set up delegations in Workday, you can either go through your inbox, which is to click on the inbox link here, and to click on the little arrow down, which says then My Delegations. You can also type in My Delegations into the search field and you'll come to the same page. Effectively, what you'll come to, and I don't have any delegations set up for myself at the moment, is this screen. You can go and have a look at the delegation history as to see what delegations have been set up in the past, or any current delegations that might already be set up within the system. But if you do want to add a particular delegation, you just, as I said, this needs to be done by the person who is trying to delegate to someone else. So, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, if Aidan, as the provost, is trying to delegate to his executive assistant, Mon, then he would need to be the one who comes into this inbox and sets that delegation up from within his inbox. So the way to do that is that you click on this Manage Delegations button. You need to put in place a start date by just clicking on, for instance, today's date. You can put in an end date. As I mentioned, you can make that for a short period of time, such as some days. You can make it for a longer period of time, for instance, a year. But you do need to have that end date in the system. Next, you're asked to actually say who you're delegating to. And so, for instance, if I was to be delegating to someone in my team, for instance, I could find it. instance, set up Lisa here as a delegate for my inbox. You're then given a default alternate, which in here is coming up as an individual. But if you don't have someone who appears here, you can untick that default alternate and put in a person instead. And I'll describe why that's important. So let's just say, for instance, it is as the default. I'll put her in there, for instance, as the default alternative delegate. But what this means is that where an inbox task is coming up relating to that particular person themselves, it routes to the alternate. So here is Lisa, for instance, and Lisa, as my executive assistant, for instance, would be eligible to approve leave on my behalf, as I mentioned earlier, according to the authorization schedule or sub-delegation instrument. However, if Lisa has applied for leave herself, it would then come up into this inbox, but it would realise that it's leave related to Lisa's own leave approval, and she can't both apply and approve her own leave. So in that rare circumstance, it would actually route or show in the inbox to the alternate delegate. So in this case, if Lisa has applied for leave, her leave application wouldn't show in the inbox when she's going in and acting as my delegate. It would only show for Natalie as the alternate delegate. So it is really important that we set that up so that individuals, as I mentioned, are applying for and approving their own leave, for example. And then you have what are the actions that can be initiated or started on behalf of that individual who's setting up the delegation. So here there are a few options available in here. We are going to be consolidating this list a little bit, but there might be, for instance, some of the more important ones, for example, are creating job requisitions, and so we'd recommend those types of things which can be started on behalf of the person who's setting up the delegation. So that's what you want to create or start on that person's behalf. The next option is what do you want to approve on that person's behalf. Now, what you need to click here is actually, in most cases, all business processes, and that will then make available the inbox for all the different activities that would be normally coming into that person's inbox. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have the authority to approve them. So while you might see them and while you might see the approval button, it's important that you're only approving those items according to the HR sub-delegation instrument that you're able to actually formally approve. And this is where it's been a little bit of a trick within Workday, in that there is some obviously visibility to the individuals who are set up as delegates, where they do get an approval button, but they actually don't hold that authority to approve that. And it's only really there designed to manage the inbox on behalf of the manager that you're supporting, for instance, and make sure that everything's getting up to the point that that manager can then approve themselves. So I'll come back a little bit to that because that's a very important concept. But we do suggest that you click for all business processes, and then there's a very important tick box here, which you need to make sure you tick, which is retain access to delegated tasks in the inbox. And what this means is that if you tick that, all the inbox tasks that person would see remain in their inbox, as well as going into their delegates inbox. So for instance here, all the to-do steps or approval steps that I would have in my inbox for Workday would also appear in Lisa's inbox when she's logging in on my behalf. If I don't have that ticked, I would no longer see any of those inbox tasks for approval, and they'll only be seen by Lisa. So that's why it's very critical that we have this retain access to delegated tasks in the inbox ticked in this case. So then you can also use the comments field, for instance, if you do have any questions or any particular restrictions, for instance, that you might want to apply here, or any comments that you might want to make. So for instance, if I want to sort of say, leave there's some type of constraint that I want to apply, that's not going to program the system to only show those 2 day ones, but it's there that then Lisa knows that that's sort of the parameters for which she can approve on my behalf, for instance. But without that, of course, it's as just according to the authorization schedule. You can also attach files if you want to. So if there's something that you want to attach to this process, you can do that as well. It may not be necessary, but effectively what you would do is then, as the person who's setting up the delegate, is hit submit. Now I won't do this because it's a live system, and it would go to the next approval step. So the next approval step for those in management level 1 through to 4 is that it will go to HR to check. And what HR is going to be doing is to check that the people that is set up here to act as a delegate is in accordance with the HR Authorization Schedule, the instrument sub-delegation that I mentioned earlier. So if the person effectively is not one management level below, or doesn't occupy a role where they're an executive assistant or as a general manager, then typically HR would sort of ask for clarification as to why that person is being set up as a delegate within Workday. So HR are checking the adherence to the requirements effectively within that instrument of sub-delegation as an approval step. Once HR is satisfied that it meets those eligibility rules, then effectively the next approval step goes through to the person's manager. So in this instance, for example, if I was to hit submit, HR was to check it, then it will go up to the Chief Operating Officer, who's my manager, to approve that particular delegation being set up. So that's the same principle all the way through. So the management levels 1 to 4, HR checks first, and then it goes through to the manager for approval. Once the manager has approved that within Workday, then that delegation is then set up and can be used from that point onwards. For management levels 5 to 8, delegations being set up don't go through HR, but they go to the manager still for approval. And so the manager will still check that that's all fine effectively for them to hold that delegation. Any questions, Mel, on the?
Yes, please. So we've just had a few questions in regards to how many people can be set up as a delegate. So could you do an EA, for example, or a deputy head of school or a manager all at once? And then in conjunction with that, if multiple delegates can be set up, can you separate them based on task?
Okay, answer is you can have multiple delegates. So to do that, you click this little plus symbol and you can set up as many delegates as you think necessary. So that's completely fine. What you can do is you can, for those individual delegates, so as a deputy head of school and a school manager and an EA, for example, you can then make sure that the time that those are set up are all different for those individuals. You can have different actions for what you can start on that person's behalf, and you can also have different actions for what that person can approve. What you can't do is make a distinction on the business process itself. So it's either all job requisitions or all employment offers. What you can't do is say only see employment offers for level E or for level D, etc. So we can't unfortunately go down to that level of granularity. So assuming that that person is able to see all of those, it needs to be an understanding that even though they might see certain tasks for approval, they may not hold the authority to actually approve that particular action within Workday. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. And there's another question in regards to if the delegate approves the task, and can the manager view the items in the archive tab once approved, or is this only an option if they tick the box to retain access to inbox tasks?
No, it's the manager. You should always keep that. I mean, what we're advising and what HR will also check is that retain access to delegated tasks in the inbox so that the manager will actually see the things that they need to approve. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you don't tick that, all things will go out of the inbox of the person, the supervisor who's setting up that delegation. So you do have, though, assuming that that's ticked accordingly, you do have the ability to go into the archive box. So if I discard this, for instance, and you'll be able to see all of the different types of actions that have been made within that in the archive folder. So that's the person who's the delegate can see all of those previously archived things on their behalf. Any other questions, Emil?
There's one more that we could address, which is our group leaders don't have an EA, but they have a research professional staff member, or also known as a lab manager, or act as a coordinator in the research group. Will HR check these delegations?
Yes, we'll check. It depends on the level that it's being set up from. So if it was, for instance, in an institute, and the person who is setting up that delegation is the institute director, which is management level 3, we would check that. If the institute, if it's the level below that, which is management level 4, HR would check that. If it's a level below that, then HR won't be checking it, but the supervisor of that person would need to still approve it. What you would need to note, though, is that it's only management levels 1 to 4 executive assistants that can do the approvals for leave and recreation leave, training approvals and recreation and other forms of leave within Workday. What the role would be of the EA otherwise, even though they can't make those approvals, would be to manage the inbox up to the point where the individual is able to approve those things on themselves. So what that means is that you can use the functionality. I'll just show this presentation so that we can see it. Is to use functionality that I can show you here, where you can basically send back. So if you want to send something back because it's not got all the information there that's ready for that manager of the unit to approve, for instance, then you can send it back to the right individuals to get that information. You can make comments in many of these where, for instance, that you've reviewed it and it's ready for that person to now approve, but you're not in a position, if you don't hold that authority according to that instrument of sub-delegations, to approve it itself in the actual system. So hopefully that's clarified it. So you can still do a lot of things in managing the inbox, reviewing it, sending it back, getting it ready, commenting for that person to actually come in and then approve it, but you can't approve it on their behalf if you don't hold one of those special authorities that we went through in the instrument of delegation. So,
thank you, Al. We can keep going.
Okay, cool. So, and that's what I wanted to maybe just go through. So once you've actually set up those delegations, it's important to know what you're going to be doing in the system. So depending on the role that you play as a delegate, whether or not you're an executive assistant, for instance, or if you're a general manager, then there will be different things that you can do, as I said, within the system. So what you'd be looking at is going into the inbox that is the delegates inbox. So what I'll do is show you how you actually do that. So I'll show you those. Oops, I don't have a picture of it, but effectively what you do, and I don't have it set up unfortunately to show you, but basically is to switch the account. So what you effectively do is, I'll show you on this page. When you come into your inbox, you can see here that I've got one set up here. So if you go to switch account, I'm set up as the delegate for the Chancellor to approve certain things. I won't go in there because it's a live account. But basically, in order to switch into the account of the person that you're acting for as a delegate, is you click on your own profile page on the picture here, and you click switch account, and then you click on the name of the person that you're trying to switch into the account of. What that will then change is that person's picture. So I would see up here, for instance, that I'd see the picture of the Chancellor. I would then see only his inbox. And so basically I would come in here and I'd see any approvals that I can make on behalf of the Chancellor that would be effectively set up here. And I would say, you have this to approve on behalf of the Chancellor, for instance. So I would only be able to approve things that I know that I have the authority to do. Otherwise, I could get those things ready up until the point that it was ready for the Chancellor, for instance, to approve in Workday. And that the other way that you would also see it is when you're actually in here with an inbox task to approve, it would say there is an approval step and there's a little grey button called switch account, and you would come again into the same inbox in order to be able to see all those inbox tasks that are ready for approval for that particular individual. So when you get into those, what you would be wanting to look through is I'm going to switch the slide here again, is for looking for certain information. So you want to be seeing what type of approval this is. If it was, for instance, a leave approval, which is what this is, an absence request. If you're an executive assistant, for instance, and you have the approval to do that, you could actually click the approval button here. So if you have the approval to do so, you review it. If you're comfortable with that information, you could click the approval button. If it's something that you can only manage the inbox up until the point where it's ready for your supervisor to approve themselves, but you don't have the authority to click the approval button, as I mentioned, you can hit the send back button if it's not got the relevant information, or you could make a comment in here and hit save for later. So what I might just quickly show you is the different buttons that you have access to in Workday. So approval means that basically once you hit the approval button, it will go on to the next step in the approval chain. So for instance, if you are an executive assistant approving on behalf of a head of school, once you hit approve, for instance, recreation leave, it won't go back to the head of school. You're doing that approval on behalf of the head of school. And so Workday is basically thinking that you, as the head of school, have approved that, and it would go to the next step in the process, which, for instance, in leave is just to put that person on leave. If it was, for instance, a job requisition or an employment offer, and you're a school manager, for instance, that are approving a professional appointment on behalf of the head of school, once you click that approval button, it would go to the next step in the process. So if it was, for instance, for a Q9 appointment in that school, once the school manager had clicked approve, then it would go up to the executive dean for approval. Now that executive dean may have already set up the FEM as a delegate, and as the FEM is a general manager that can also approve professional staff appointments, and they click on that approve, then it would effectively conclude that particular process. So in that example, neither the head of school nor the executive dean has actually approved that professional appointment. It's been approved by the school manager on behalf of the head of school and the FEM on behalf of the executive dean. So that's just something important to note, is that when you are clicking approve, if you have the authority to do so, you're doing it on behalf of the person who set you up as their delegate. It doesn't go back to that delegate again for their own approval. You're doing it on their behalf, and it goes to the next step in the process. The send back button is if you want to send it back with some information, for instance, to update. So let's take, for instance, it's a employment agreement, and you've reviewed all the information within Workday. You feel it's missing some justification, for example, as to why it should have a market loading or something like that that's coming, for instance, to a head of school. You can click that send back button, ask, for example, HR or for the person who's generated that, that original hiring process to put the information in and say, could you please provide more justification? Once it's come back again to the head of school, for example, and you're comfortable with it, you could then let the head of school know that it's ready for their approval. So that send back functionality is very useful in order to make sure that the task is ready for approval. What I would just mention in regards to sending things back is that depending on where you're sending it back from, it may actually go back all the way through. So I've got the, sorry, bear with me for a sec. Here we go. Back through the chain. So if, for instance, the provost is sending something back through the executive dean, head of school, etc., and they can only send it back to HR or to the hiring manager, then basically, if it's sent back, for instance, to HR, then it would have to go back through finance, the head of school, executive dean, etc., again for approval. But just note that depending on whether or not you want to use the send back function or the comment field, if it's a minor adjustment, for instance, that needs to be made in the system. So that's something I might need to take some questions on, but just be very cautious of the send back functionality, in that it will require it to go back through the same approval pathway that it's come from. Add approvers is where you have a situation where there are multiple managers, for example. So someone who holds a role in one school and an institute, for instance, that requires two managers to approve something. If you hit add approvers, it will send it to the next point in the approval chain. Save for later is useful functionality. And so what you can do often if you want to make comments, for example, for the person who set you up as a delegate to know that that task is ready for approval, is to fill in the comments field. So you can see here, for instance, that you can add some comments. If you hit the save for later button, it will save those comments in that particular task, but it won't approve it, it won't send it back, and it will just stay within that person's inbox. So you might, for instance, say to the head of school, if you're an executive assistant, this is now ready for your approval. Hit the save for later button, and that would save those comments against that particular to-do step. So again, very useful functionality to note for people who are working as delegates. Then you have this deny and cancel. If you do select these and we say, please be very, very cautious in using these particular buttons, they would effectively kill that process and it would have to be regenerated. So if you effectively denied or cancelled leave, it would effectively make that leave invalid, and that person would need to reapply for that leave, for instance, in Workday. So they're the really important sort of buttons to note. Sometimes the buttons might not be fully visible on the screen, and you can click these little 3 dots, for instance, and it will bring up the other additional buttons. So sometimes that save for later button is only visible when you click the 3 buttons next to the approval buttons. I might just pause there and just see, Mel, if there's any questions on those at all.
There is a question, but I'll deal with that one. It's offline. Thank you.
So that's something just to note, as I mentioned, is to only click on the buttons as appropriate, make comments as necessary, and get it ready then for those things that you don't have the authority to approve, to get it ready for your supervisor or manager to effectively approve within Workday. This is the send back functionality that I mentioned earlier. So if you are trying to send it back to someone, you just select the individual that you're trying to send it back to. For instance, here you'd select either Virginia or Natalie. You make a comment in the field as to why you want to send it back, and you hit the submit button, and it will go back to that individual to make those changes. I'm just going to see if there's something else that I've missed. Yeah, so this is the page that I was going to mention earlier. So in order to switch account, which I've shown, just to note that you'll know that you're in the right person's inbox when you're set up. You'll see that that person's picture changes. So it's not your own any longer. It's the person you're acting as delegate. And you can only see that person's inbox. You can't see anything else of their profile within Workday. Again, just to note that when you do make an approval on behalf of that person, it will create an audit log of that transaction. So you'd see here, for instance, that if I was acting on behalf of Rob Moffat, that it would record that I have done that approval on behalf of Rob. So there's a full audit trail of that. And in order to make sure that people are doing the right approvals within Workday, we do run a report daily to just see whether or not there's been any approvals in the system which are outside of those requirements that we've got within the HR sub-delegations instrument. So for instance, if a person who's not one management level below, or they're not fulfilling one of those special roles like a general manager or EA is doing an approval, then we would be seeing that within the system and would need to take action accordingly on that and potentially re-ask for approval from the authorised officer that's been approved in error, for instance. So I'll just pause on that one and to see if there's any other questions on that.
Nothing at this stage, Al.
Okay, great. Just some other little things to note. You can do inbox filters. So if there's bulk approvals for certain items, you can set up inbox filters, and you can also do bulk approvals. And so if, again, let's say, for instance, there's a lot of people who are enrolled in a particular online learning program, and you don't want to sort of separately go one by one, you can filter on, for instance, that topic, online learning, for instance, or whatever the case might be, the title of the program, and hit select all. Assuming you're comfortable that all of them are approved, you could hit select all and approve. So just to note, there are some things within the inbox which do help you make it a more efficient process when clicking approval as well. All right, I think we're close out of time. Any other questions, Mel?
No, nothing at this stage.
All right, there is some videos available for you. So if you do need any other questions or help on setting up delegations, I know that it is a bit complex, both in terms of interpreting the HR Authorization Schedule or instrument of sub-delegation, as well as sort of getting it actually set up within Workday itself. So we're obviously more than happy to come out and help set those up. It's only a few minute exercise. There is the video available. Ask HR can also be available for any questions as well. But of course, we're more than happy to help, so that if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out and we'll give you that support. And now, is there any? Okay,
There's
just while we're, sorry.
Sorry, there is a couple of questions, but I'll take those ones offline after the session.
Right. So there was also the daily digest, and this is something just to note. So if you want to see what is available for approval within Workday, then everyone should by default receive that daily digest. If you want to receive a copy of the one that is the supervisor, for instance, if you're an executive assistant to a head of school and you want to see that daily digest from the head of school, the delegations doesn't necessarily give you access to all of those. You do need to set that up as a forward, for instance, as a rule within Outlook, and that could forward you that daily digest from their inbox as well. So you would know both what's in your inbox as well as what's in their inbox for approval. And as I mentioned, there is a lot of guides available. We have Ask HR, which will give you some good support if you need to, and also your local HR partnering teams. So if you do need any help in setting up delegations, more than happy to ask you to reach out to one of those groups or help as well if there is any more specific questions as well. And then I think we're probably out of time. And is there anything else finally before we wrap up?
So we do just have one question in regards to could a HULA 6 lab manager start the process for a casual appointment for a professor, not necessarily approve, but start the process?
Yeah, so for a job requisition, for instance, you can fill in all the details up until the point where you hit submit. So what you would do is save for later, and then so you can do that start on my behalf job requisition, fill in all the information, hit save for later. And then the professor can just read through, assuming they're all happy with it. They just have to hit the submit in the system, and then that's it. So they don't have to effectively do any input. They just have to review it and hit submit, and that's completely fine. All right. Well, good luck. Thank you very much for all your time today. I hope it is reasonably straightforward. As I said, if you do need any help, more than happy to have you reach out. But otherwise, forward to hearing how it all goes with delegations. Thanks, everybody.